Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and the title of this lesson is A Call for Unity. Now, as a church, we are called to unity, and as any organization, the laws of organization dictate that any organization which wants to see its agenda not only survive but flourish, for that organization, unity is paramount, whereas division and disharmony are repugnant to the manifestation of that ideal. And the church is no exception. Now, that we are to be unified is settled beyond question, but the great unanswered question is how. And as it's outlined in this passage, we read it's not so much how, but in who. Just some background information before we delve into the text itself. Ephesus was a major commercial and cultural center and city in the Roman province of Achaia, which corresponds to the modern country of Greece. And Paul laid the church there in 53 AD on his return home from Jerusalem, and we read of this in Acts 18, and then in the 19th chapter we read that he spent a 2-year period of time there. So he not only evangelized but edified. That was the nature of his mission, because travel would have prevented him from, would have kept him at, would have made it pragmatic for him to stay at various locations given the difficulties attached to travel in that day, and he was quite a traveler. But we can imagine it wouldn't have been unusual for him to spend 1 or 2 year periods in a single location. And then 10 years after the events described in Acts 19, we find him writing this letter, and the Ephesian assembly was not so doctrinally confused as was, for example, the Galatians or the Colossians, but they really struggled from uniting the diversity within them, it being a cosmopolitan city, and this was a struggle by no means unique to them. So Paul wrote not for correction, but for encouragement, and let's see what he has to say. I call upon you, therefore, I, the prisoner of the Master, to walk worthily of the calling with which you were called. Now, the therefore, read in its original Greek context, by that it connects it to the previous 3 chapters, and the Ephesians, the 6th chapter formula is systematic in its approach, and it the first 3 chapters describe doctrine, and then the 4th, 5th, and 6th chapter describe the practical application and the operation and the manifestation of that doctrine in action. And the prisoner of the Master, that's how he considered himself. He enslaved himself. It was his controlling thought. He was as submitted as a servant to a slave. He willfully did it. It was a price that he was willing to pay, but even though he was the most exalted in rank, he considered himself the most lowly in station. And that's the paradox of ministry and Christianity, that the ideal is the servant leader, whereas the world conditions us to associate leadership with having servants. As the Master defines it, it's to be a servant. And to walk worthily of the calling with which you are called, this is a challenge that is issued for every age, because in any age there are outsiders and skeptics and naysayers who want to pick apart inconsistencies in our walk, in our talk, or both to discredit us and prove us fools. But when we work worthily of the calling, when our walk matches our talk, when we practice what we preach, we have nothing to be worried about. And how are we to walk? Well, he answers that with all humility and meekness, with patience, bearing one another in love. Now, the enduring aspect of that means that it's not a fleeting fad, it's a life investment. So that's why we have to develop patience. And humility and meekness is the attitude with which builds the patience. And everything ties into love. That's the central unifying glue of unity and brotherhood. Being eager to guard the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, one body and one Spirit, as you also were called in one hope of your calling, one Master, one faith, one baptism, one Elohim and Father of all, who is above all, and through all, and in you all. So therein we read that even though the humans are, humanly speaking, the church, and by church I don't mean the building, I mean the people in it, because we limit ourselves when we limit our conception of a church to the 4 physical walls. we're called to live out the faith, not just in the walls, but outside the walls. We gather there weekly so that we can effectively witness in the world. And but more to the point, I guess these are the unifying factors. We're one body. That's the church is analogously compared to the body of the Messiah, and that he's the head, as we will soon read in a subsequent passage. And the various members with each of their respective gifts are functionally analogous to body parts, and that Paul's most extensive coverage on this is 1 Corinthians 12, so turn there if you're more curious. I'm actually going to censor myself from saying more on that subject. One Spirit, one hope, one calling, one master, one faith, one baptism. These are all prerequisites which unite us. Now, we may have our differences in doctrines, which vary according to the disparate denominations, but we all accept the fact that the atonement, and we all have our different ways of celebrating it and memorializing it, and different interpretations attached to the ceremony of it. But we're really, the things which unite us are what call us Christian. Now, the word Christian, the suffix IAN, is Latin for partisan. So where each of the church that proclaims the name has the right to call itself that. There's a lot of theological bickering about the credentials, but I think that organized religion is the best in that you have to rely on a system that you can't independently arrive on, most beyond the range of the average congregants to form their own systematic theology. So it makes more sense for them to attach them to one who can. But I myself, I don't fully identify with any organized church. I think organized church is better in itself, but I couldn't tell you which one is necessarily worthy of the fullness of my proclamation. So I do somewhat ironically encourage you to find an organized church, but you're on your own for figuring out that one. You owe it to yourself to study everything that a church has to offer and think what you can offer that church. But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of the gift of Messiah. Now, grace is the divine enablement which justifies us, which declares us innocent even though we are wicked. And it's through grace by faith that we are saved. We read of that in Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. And it's the gift of the Messiah, so the grace giver is the source of our grace, who gives it to us, and we try and return whatever we can, however infinitesimally. That is why it says, when he went up on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts to men. But what does he went up mean, except that he also first went down into the lower parts of the earth? So this is the paradoxical dynamic of being exalted and uplifted. Now we read in Luke 14:11 and 18:14 and Matthew 23:12 this principle: he who humbles himself shall be exalted. And the master was certainly practicing what he preached. He humbled himself on the cross and was exalted in the resurrection. So that's the upward and downward direction of our atonement. It's always upward and forward for us, but for him it was downward and upward. And one thing for all time, eternally efficacious. And he gave gifts to men. These are the gifts which enable us to proclaim his name and to live worthy of our calling. Now, the Spirit is the dispenser of gifts, and ultimately every believer has at least one. So it's really incumbent upon a pastor to utilize each member's, not to do all the work himself, but to utilize the respective contributions and gifts of each member's to make the church more than the sum of its own part. Because if not directed, the exercise of spiritual gifts can be a source of pride, and pride results in division. So he who went down is also the one who went up far above all the heavens to fill all. And he himself gave some as apostles, some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as shepherds and teachers. So these are the office corresponding to the gifts. Now the apostles were they were first century office. It was one who was a eyewitness of the resurrection. So Paul, even though he never beheld the master in the flesh, was still included in that exalted rank, in that he saw him in resurrected form. In Acts 9 we read of the encounter. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has always operated with the office of apostles. It's, as far as I know, the only church that does. They have 12 of them, just like the 12, and then they have the president, first and second counselor. So their ruling body is, the nucleus of it is 15 people. And some as prophets. Now, prophecy, the Latter-day Saint Church is led by one who each member regards as a prophet, but they're really the only denomination which institutionalizes the office. Now, there's a misnomer that the practice of prophecy is obsolete, that it went out with the writing of the New Testament, but in Joel 2:32, he envisions a democratic dispensation whereby one prophets. Now, prophet is not necessarily issue a prediction, but often a proclamation for the future. So prophets are always grounded in the present, with an eye on the past, with the mind to the future. But I think that many individual believers in other denominations have prophesied. I'm even aware of a few people with the prophetic ministry outside of the Latter-day Saint Church, and it's still in operation. But be mindful, there are measures for determining the false prophet from the authentic article scattered throughout Scripture, and you really owe it to yourself to test what the prophets say and align it always in this book. So never cause any charismatic charlatan to distract you from what this book says by what they have to say. Always hold this book up to what they have to say. Now, evangelists, without evangelism, the body of believers could not, like any organization, growth. The church is an organization and an organism, and as in any other organism, growth is essential to survive and flourish, and evangelism is how the church grows. These are the ones who spread the good news of the light to those who are enmeshed in darkness. And pastor is just shepherd is just the pastor of a local assembly, and teachers is what I'm doing right now. So we all have a role to play, no matter how humble we're to give our gifts to who we can in whatever ways we can. For the perfecting of the saints, to the work of service, to a building up of the body of Messiah. So this is the direction in which all of our gifts and contributions are invested. It's toward an uplifting and upbuilding of others, collectively known as the body of the Messiah, or referred to as here, known alternately as the Temple of the Ruach Hadesh, and a host of other names. But by body of Messiah, he means church. Until we have all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of Yahweh, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the completeness of Messiah. So this is a future promise of which we have cause to look forward to, that our limitations in knowledge and faith will be eradicated at the resurrection, when we witness the first fruit of that resurrection, and all of our weaknesses and limitations will no longer hinder us. So that we should no longer be children, tossed and borne about by every wind of teaching, by the trickery of men, unto the craftiness of leading astray. So the presence of heretics or false teachers was something that wasn't particularly prevalent in the Ephesians assembly. He never addresses any of the erroneous teachings or dismantles their arguments, but he issues a warning for them to always be mindful of those who imperceptibly creep in, because even a perfect assembly is only perfect for that second in time, and as any organism, it's subject to decay and is never ever not immune to penetration from false doctrine. And trickery of men, this is the ways of the heretics. They're deceivers. Now, a lot of what the good news evangelist claims seems too good to be true, but it's all consistent with Scripture, whereas the trickery of heretics is too good to be true and not consistent with scriptures. Craftiness of leading astray, so their purpose isn't towards unity, they're towards them. So they're trying to draw you away from the nucleus of unity and towards them. And there's to be no element or or individual of selfishness in any assembly. But speaking the truth in love, we grow up in all respects into him who is the head, Messiah. Now, I earlier mentioned that the Messiah is positioned in the head of the body of the Messiah. And the truth in love is how we are to speak. We're to unite them. Now, truth without love is brutality, where love without truth is hypocrisy. So we're to always maintain the two in union, and to speak the truth in love, that means not necessarily how we say something is as important as what we say. And this is to progress towards more messianic character, from whom the entire body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the working by which each part does its share, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. So that's, I honestly don't have enough time to give that verse the fullness of attention I would have liked. But you can interpret it for yourself. I've hoping to have given you the tools so far and throughout other discourses. And tune in next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.